The British regularly insisted that India, while a great civilization, was not a nation. Being ruled by the strictures of caste and then Muslims, India was too divided by caste, religion, and region to be considered a nation. But by the late 1800s, this view, in the minds of Indians, started to be contested, taking pride in its past and future potential. Indians started to formulate a sense of nationhood that was rooted in an anti-colonial critique of the British Raj. Next, we're going to examine the emergence of Indian nationalist thought and delineate its very emergence. So we're going to look at 4 items. First, we're going to examine the initial polite loyalist critiques of British rule that pointed out the economic exploitation of India. They did not wish to end colonial rule, but had gained minor concessions and constitutionalism from the Raj. Second, we'll analyze how a new generation of Indian critics, enabled by English language education, links with Britain, and an exposure to the nationalist ideas of the West, ensured that the very class of people, English-educated Indians, the British thought would be enamored to the Raj, ended up being its harshest critics. Thirdly, we'll look at the Indian National Congress, the political party which represented these initial moderate nationalists. It was the party that would transition after 1919 into a more confrontational party. And lastly, we'll look at the 1905 partition of Bengal and the subsequent Swadeshi agitations, which galvanized nationalist opinion and organization. Indian nationalism, in spite of attempts by the British to divide it, was the first to develop and fashion an organized response to colonial exploitation. Now, let's start with an overview of the social, economic, and political backdrop to nationalism. This requires going back just a bit. When it comes to understanding the beginnings of Indian nationalism, we need a wide context. Like any nationalist movement, it was not monolithic. It had inherent contradictions and problems, but this was not unique in the world. What is most remarkable about Indian nationalism is that it overcame these internal divisions to ultimately gain freedom in 1947. And of course, the significance of Indian nationalism was marked. India was the first organized anti-European colonial movement in a non-European settler colony that actually succeeded. India became, after independence, the world's largest democracy and a role model for other colonial subjects yearning for freedom. Indian nationalism started to really emerge after the 1850s in a piecemeal manner. It had its roots in a combination of political, social, religious, and economic developments that had been transpiring since the mid-19th century. First, some definitions. What is nationalism? Roughly put, it's the love, glorification, and prioritization of nation and the people who constitute it. Now, this was really significant for India, because who ran India? Britain. We should read the contest between Indian nationalism and British rule with a subtitle, Contesting the Nation. Britain claimed that India was not a nation and that it was simply British. Indians, naturally and justifiably, claimed they were in fact a nation and sought to demonstrate this, first politely and then forcefully, later under Gandhi. Let's start with the impact of new forms of learning and education. Macaulay's influence in the 1830s, in which we saw the company replace Persian with English as the language of government, had profound long-term effects. The introduction of Western education and the institutions that were built around it, colleges and schools, created a new sense of social mobility and status. Now, what subjects do you think Indians learned in their English language courses? Well, the whole Western canon of literature, philosophy, politics, you name it. And what specific works of English and Western thinkers might they have come across which spoke about politics, liberties, and rights? The broader effects of their studies, directly in books and because they learned a European language, was to expose Indians to the currents of intellectual European thought. This included empiricism, Marxism, positivism, utilitarianism, but also the ideas espoused by John Stuart Mill's famous treatise on liberty. Indian students would have read about the ideas that animated the French Revolution and would start to see that the basic rights and ideas championed by Europeans were being denied to Indians. Another byproduct of Macaulay's 1835 Minute on Education was to create a lingua franca that allowed Tamil, Punjabi, and various Hindi speakers to now communicate and share ideas more easily. Previously, linguistic diversity was a stumbling block to all India mobilization. Even Persian was not popularized and well-known enough across India to create a fully national language. As Indians flocked to English language and bilingual institutions, it had the effect of making English a primary language of communication across India. This meant that distant regions of India were now more connected with each other. Tamil speakers could now use English to communicate with Urdu speakers in Delhi, with Bengali speakers in Calcutta, and Hindi speakers in Benares. And this connectivity could be used to spread messages that were loyal, apolitical, or even subversive. And this was really significant for a good deal of India's eventual nationalist leaders and those who won freedom from the British, such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, all had received an English language-based education. Some even went abroad for their courses of study, such as Nehru, who went to Cambridge University, and B.R. Ambedkar, who went to Columbia University in the United States. Indeed, the British had reservations about the ballooning numbers of English-educated Indians. While they knew they needed a steady stream of subordinate bureaucrats to manage the Raj, they were also equally wary of there being too many educated Indians. They might, in larger numbers, start questioning the Raj and asking uncomfortable questions about governance, taxation, and policies. Indeed, the British official Mount Stuart Elphinstone had noted back in the early 1800s that English education for Indians would be, quote, our high road back to Europe. And boy, did the chap get it right, at least partially. Now, we've seen how British attitudes changed since the 1850s onwards. Did the British allow Indians a hand in governing at all? Barely. Indians, even if they were highly educated and capable of the job, were not allowed any say in the higher decision-making of the Raj. The upper echelons of colonial governance were exclusively white and British. One viceroy flatly said, quote, the rule of India is a British rule, and any other rule being in circumstances of the case is impossible. Wow. And when it came to the Indian civil service, that steel frame of the Raj, by the early 1900s, it was bordering on a verge of authoritarianism. ICS men saw no need to listen to the British public or Indians themselves, and they held on to this firm sense of stern paternalism. They knew what was best, and they believed that only Englishmen were capable of ruling India. Indians, they generally believed, because of their culture, religion, and race, were not capable of ruling as large a country as India. And this racial discrimination made its way into the ICS examinations. Aurobindo Ghosh, later to be labeled a political extremist by the British, failed his ICS exam due to a deficiency in horsemanship. Another Indian candidate was failed for coughing during his examination. And here, racism clearly prevented worthy Indian candidates from becoming more involved in the governance of their own country. Despite numerous petitions by Indians to have simultaneous ICS examinations in India and in Britain, the Raj claimed it was administratively difficult, as if running India were any easier. If you were Indian and you wanted to compete, you had to pay your own way to England. And at the very most, Indians made up no more than 5% of all ICS officers. So qualified Indians were disadvantaged from the ICS, not only due to race, but also due to distance. Now, do you think educated Indians took this lightly? Well, of course they didn't. When it came to education, racism sows the seeds of anti-colonial sentiment. I mean, think about it. An informally institutionalized racism, plus huge discrepancies between Indians and Europeans, plus the ICS's unapologetic exclusiveness, all prevented Indians from obtaining these higher posts. You see what you'll get? Naturally expected resentment. To put it in context, even the Mughals never racially or religiously discriminated against Hindus so much. Now that we've examined the background and context of Indian nationalism, let's move on to some of the early critiques of British rule. The first Indian nationalists were loyalists who critiqued the Raj's economic practice, not its political practice. Their demands were fairly moderate, but their critique of Britain's economic relationship with India was poignant and to the point. They focused on Britain's parasitic economic relationship with India. As we know, Britain extracted a significant economic advantage from India. It was, after all, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And since the late 1700s, Britain had latched it into a parasitic and anti-development economic relationship. British rule had essentially reversed India's historic trading position with the world. India had gone from a net exporter of finished goods to a net importer of finished British goods. And India's agrarian economy was exposed to the forces of globalization and swings in prices like never before. This all had devastating effects upon Indian cultivators, farmers, and common folk. This brings us to the first Indian economic nationalist, Sir Dadabhai Naoroji. Naoroji was of a Parsi or Old Persian background and was born in Bombay. In 1876, he published a book called The Poverty of India, and in 1901, the more pointedly titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Naoroji postulated the train of wealth theory. This was a theory that argued that the colonial connection between Britain and India had been draining wealth out of India without really giving anything back. Specifically, Naoroji touched upon something that related to the ICS and educated Indians. He noted the home charges of the Raj's budget. This was the entire cost of administration, everything from magistrates' courtrooms and their wigs to ICS officers and their relocation costs. And Naoroji was onto something. The British were the best paid imperialists on earth. They were better compensated in terms of salaries and perks than any other Europeans. To give you one quick example, the highest paid post in the French colonial empire was to be the first president of the Court of Appeals in Algeria at £720 per year. The Chief Justice of Bengal, who was not even the best paid official under the Raj, received nearly £5,000 per year plus duty-free currency exchanges and relocation costs. A wide gap. Naoroji sought to inform an educated Indian public about the true net losses under colonialism. He thought these home charges were unacceptable. For example, able-bodied Indians could do the same job at a much lower cost. But the British, as we've seen, excluded them from these posts almost completely. Naoroji argued that the cost of the Raj itself was stunting Indian economic growth. British colonialism, to him, created such costs for its own maintenance, and this had been depleting India's wealth for generations. What Naoroji proposed, therefore, was a radical reprioritization of the Raj's budget. He argued that the much-heralded public investments in infrastructure, such as the railways, were too large compared with what India really needed to help the masses: agricultural relief, education, and public health. Naoroji wanted more money spent on public services, and he also wanted the Raj to prop up the Indian rupee to alleviate the poverty that had resulted in such lower prices after the 1870s. But it's important to stress that Naoroji's critique was tempered. He didn't advocate Swaraj or self-rule. Instead, he pressed the British government to open up the echelons of Indian government to qualified, educated Indians. But the officials of the Raj never considered this. Naoroji eventually became frustrated and hinted, in a somewhat challenging passage, that India might, quote, under the persistence of the present evil bleeding, fall from the British frying pan into the Russian fire, or free itself from a destructive rule. This was, if anything, a subtle form of constitutional resistance. But this is the most confrontational early Indian nationalism got. It was still polite, gentlemanly, elite, and, above all, loyalist. Now that we have looked at the early critiques of British rule, let's turn to the political party that would eventually lead India to freedom, the Indian National Congress. In a way, the loyalism of Indian nationalism reflected the institutional forms it took. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 by Alan Octavian Hume, an Englishman who was fairly sympathetic with the modest demands of educated Indians. It served kind of as an annual gathering and forum. The early Congress was certainly elitist. It was composed mainly of Western-educated Hindus who were the beneficiaries of colonial rule. There was a substantial Bengali presence within the early party. At first, they were moderate and loyal to British rule. They saw no need to make reform of British rule a popular cause. You could kind of call it a gentleman's reform club. In fact, most of them were trained as lawyers, and because of this, their annual meetings were usually held over the Christmas holidays, when they all had time off. Now, the early Congress achieved some moderate successes before 1905. They had moderate aims, which included, for example, greater Indian representation on provincial councils. Nothing terribly radical or demanding. And its leaders and old men were largely moderates. These included Motilal Nehru, the father of India's future Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Surendranath Banerjee, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Banerjee had been dismissed from his ICS examination because he calculated his age according to the Hindu and not Western calendar. So it was quite fitting that he opened the Congress's first annual session in Bombay. He had philosophical and personal grievances. So by the late 1800s, Indian nationalism was not only polite and loyalist, but fairly moderate and tame in its agenda. It was filled with the beneficiaries of British rule and what it had opened up for them. But this all started to change in 1898 with the arrival of Viceroy Lord Curzon to India. Now, let's turn to Curzon's arrival and the 1905 partition of Bengal. Viceroy Curzon of Kedleston arrived in Calcutta in 1898, and from the very beginning it was clear that he brought a more conservative and reactionary attitude to Indian governance. Curzon had an uncompromising attitude about the Raj and a particular disdain for educated Indians. To be blunt, Curzon was as hidebound and patronizing as you get, and his attitudes tended to radicalize his opposition, both British and Indian. You see, Curzon was an aggressive imperialist, convinced of England's duty to rule India. Curzon envisioned British India as the premier Asian power under British rule. He was very different from the more sympathetic viceroy, Marquis of Ripon. Between 1880 and 1884, Ripon took sincere, if limited, interest in getting Indians more involved in government. And he heeded suggestions from his advisors that Indian educated opinion couldn't be repressed or ignored. But Curzon ended up dismissing warnings by most of his advisors that accommodations needed to be made with educated Indian opinion. Curzon just didn't care. The main group that Curzon rubbed the wrong way were English-educated Indians. Curzon held scorn for them. Even if they were polite, they questioned how the British ruled India too much, in his opinion. And from his arrival, Curzon initiated a number of policy changes which specifically targeted educated Indians, the very people who gained from the colonial connection. One example was the Universities Act of 1904. When he arrived, Curzon initially wanted to shutter all the universities. He saw them as breeding dens of sedition. But he did manage to push through a massive educational conference and a study which culminated in the 1904 legislation. This legislation greatly restricted the number of entrants every year to the universities in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. It basically made it more difficult to gain admission. While premised on the notion of fiscal economy, it was really a way to keep urban, educated critiques of British rule at arm's length. And Curzon's contempt of educated Bengali opinion was never hidden. In fact, at the Calcutta University graduation in 1905, he told his audience that all they learned about the West and its conception of truth were not universal. He said, quote, "I hope I am making no false or arrogant claim when I say that the highest ideal of truth is to a large extent a Western conception." Now, I can't think of a better way to insult newly anointed graduates. And in 1905, Curzon pushed through legislation that would end up radicalizing the Indian National Congress. And it was ominous of what was to start 15 years later and ultimately wrap up 42 years after that. This was the 1905 partition of Bengal. In a way, the reaction after foreshadowed the more aggressive nationalism after 1920. It offered a preview of the Gandhian techniques of nonviolence and civil disobedience. This was when the Congress would first try to engage in mass political mobilization against British rule. In a way, it was the climax of Lord Curzon's new aggressive and, frankly, obnoxious imperialism. Curzon's rationale, from an administrative perspective, was, on the surface, sensible. Bengal was the most populous province in British India, with over 70 million people. It was larger than most European countries. So naturally, it would be easier to administer if it were smaller. The rhetoric of administrative efficiency punctuated discussions over the idea. Curzon wanted to split up dissenting opinion along the lines of religion in Bengal. You see, Western Bengal was largely, though not exclusively, Hindu, while the rural eastern regions were overwhelmingly Muslim. But they were all Bengalis with proud local and cultural identity that often made religion secondary in importance. Curzon made a deal with Bengali Muslim leaders, promising them that they would have a Muslim unity unknown since the Mughal era. And as we now know, in a secret communique, Curzon admitted that, quote, Bengal united is a power. Bengal divided will pull in different ways. One of our main objectives is to split up and thereby weaken a solid body of opponents to our rule. When the news was announced, there was a massive fallout and backlash. To Congress, it smacked of British high-handedness guided by the principle of divide and rule. They were energized by the 1905 partition. The Congress organized rallies and demonstrations in Calcutta. They were tame and initially ineffective. But then they became more mass-based and appealed to popular anger and resentment against Curzon and the British. What emerged when Congress and Bengali leaders started to engage the masses was known as the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi means of one's own country. It was a form of protest which boycotted British and foreign goods, the very symbols of India's economic servitude. It reminded Indians that they once produced their own cloth and goods. Swadeshi sought to demonstrate that they could do without British goods, and this meant, by extension, the British connection. Congressmen such as Surendranath Banerjee organized the boycott of British goods. They burnt foreign cloth in large bonfires. And it was not just cloth. They boycotted government schools and shops, which picked up in intensity when partition went into effect on the 16th of October, 1905. But was Swadeshi effective? Well, economically and fiscally, yes. It surprised the British. Imports of textiles plummeted almost 35%. Swadeshi hit British economic interests in Bengal hard and swiftly. And British industrialists who had large factories back home and planters who had large plantations in India were both hit equally. Their profits plummeted. But the Swadeshi agitations led to the emergence of inevitable forms of political extremism. Nationalists such as Aurobindo Ghosh, Lal Lajpat Rai, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak chucked the polite constitutional route out with the bathwater. They demanded immediate and full independence, or Purna Swaraj. And since the goal was noble, they argued, any and all means were justified in getting the British out. You can imagine how some interpreted this. Yet the Swadeshi movement also exposed some religious problems between Hindus and Muslims in Bengal over the mass mobilization. Bengali Muslim leaders largely supported the partition, as they knew they had fallen behind their Hindu countrymen in education, economic prominence, and overall influence in government. And crucially, the slogans and symbolism of Swadeshi also carried religious connotations. The rallying cry for the largely Hindu-led Congress Party and its followers was Bande Mataram. In Bengali, this means Hail to the Mother Goddess, that is, India. While not explicit in its view towards Muslims, it drew heavily upon Hindu symbolism and the superior demographics they enjoyed in politics. And the boycotting was also problematic. Urban Bengali Hindus, the core of the Congress Party in eastern India, were economically better off than the mass of rural, poor Bengali Muslim farmers and peasants. Many Bengali Muslim traders and peasants could not afford to boycott foreign cloth, lest their families lost everything. Those who traded in it needed their incomes, so the poor Muslims couldn't afford more expensive handmade Indian cloth. So Bengali Muslim participation was kind of patchy. But into the eyes of some Swadeshi activists, Muslims' nationalism were already being suspicious. Bande Mataram also sent shivers down the spine of the Raj. Never before had the colonial state faced such organized and mass agitation against its rule. European residents in Calcutta were rattled in seeing throngs of protesters chanting and boycotting and burning cloth. It was people power on the streets. The Raj's reaction was harsh. Police were sent to clear picketers and demonstrators. Hundreds, if not thousands, were imprisoned. The protests often turned violent. And Bengal saw the repressive hand of the colonial state, with its police, intelligence, and military assets brought to bear upon Bengal and supposed seditionists. Back in Britain, they had had enough of Curzon. A newly elected Gladstone Liberal government replaced Curzon with the more moderate Lord Minto. Viceroy Minto made overtures to the Congress about reversing partition and giving the Congress some political concessions. Gopal Krishna Gokhale was able to persuade Surendranath Banerjee and others to end the boycott and Swadeshi agitations. This was done in the hope that Minto and the British would be more accommodating and would actually reverse the partition. Yet political extremism had been lit in Bengal, and it continued. Small terrorist outfits emerged in Bengal, usually among young radicalized students. They actually gained access to bomb-making facilities and small arms, and their bombs occasionally targeted British officials. They robbed banks to finance their operations. So you can see the language of Swadeshi sometimes became mixed with political extremism. Radical students donned disguises, sometimes as women, sometimes as wandering holy men. The recently developed science of fingerprinting classification, developed in India by Sir Edward Henry and his Indian assistants, Azizul Haq and Hemchandra Bose, by the late 1880s had proved invaluable in policing and intelligence capabilities of the colonial state. And forms of Bengali radicalism would live with the Raj until its expiration in 1947. In 1912, when Viceroy Lord Hardinge made his ceremonial entry into Delhi, he was wounded by a bomb thrown by an Indian revolutionary, Basanta Kumar Biswas. Curzon, as we can see, unleashed forces which both the British and even the Congress could not always control. Now, what could the British do then to cool and assuage Indian anger? Aside from reverse the partition? Well, you got it. The British offered political concessions. This led to the Indian Councils Act, known as the Morley-Minto Reforms in 1909, drafted by Viceroy Minto and the Secretary of State for India, John Morley. This act allowed Indians to be elected to various legislative councils for the very first time. These councils, though, had limited powers. It did not meet Congress's demands for more self-governance and home rule. The act made special accommodations for Indian Muslims. They were given reserved seats in the councils and in municipal and district boards in excess of their proportion of the population. So more than 25%, in some instances, Muslims had more than 25% seats. And Muslims could only vote for Muslim candidates. This meant that Indian Muslims would have a larger share in the military strategic Punjab, since they were a majority there. One effect of the act was that it created communal electorates. It created supposed monolithic communal blocs based on religion. I mean, even British officials had their own voting bloc. Hindu nationalists resented such special treatment for Muslims, and the mechanism was clearly meant, in their eyes, to divide and rule. In a way, it was not terribly similar from Curzon's partition, just that it was more massaged and politically acceptable. The aim of the 1909 Act was to win over the moderate bloc of Congress and split extremists from the moderates. It looked good on the surface. It looked liberal. But it was actually meant to perpetuate British power rather than diminish it. Okay, in this lecture, we've examined a lot. We've looked at how a new generation of Indians enabled by English language education and links with Britain started to end up as the harshest critics of British rule. We've looked at the context in which early loyalist critiques of British economic policies emerged. We've examined the founding of the Indian National Congress. And lastly, we've looked at the 1905 partition of Bengal and the subsequent Swadeshi agitations, which galvanized nationalist opinion and organization. As a result of these changes, Indian nationalism started to experiment with techniques of mass mobilization and populism and confrontation, which would later be employed by Gandhi and the Congress Party after 1920. So it's in this context that we should see India on the cusp of World War I. By 1914, the Raj was secure and able to marginalize radical from moderate nationalists. But it was an arrangement that couldn't last forever, as the events and strains of the Great War were soon to demonstrate.